What is up, truth seekers? I am in Texas this week, so if you are watching the YouTube video, you are getting a special Texas edition of this intro. Check this out. Huge improvements in mood and cognitive function. This is a review from Andrew N. on our mood, memory, and brain supplement from Heart and Soil. I have been taking Heart and Soil supplements for several months now. While I absolutely believe each of the supplements they sell is supporting my health, and I have noticed improvements systematically, nothing else has affected me as dramatically as starting to take mood, memory, and brain a few weeks ago. I've noticed significant increases in focus and cognitive performance, as well as having dramatically more patience with my loved ones, even the 2-year-old. I could not recommend it more highly. I love these. Thank you guys for submitting your reviews. At Heart and Soil Supplements, we make the finest grass-fed, grass-finished, desiccated organ supplements on the planet from regeneratively raised cattle in New Zealand, where there has never been a case of bovine spongiform encephalopathy. This brain is pristine. This is the best brain on the planet, and you better believe it is encapsulated into gelatin capsules and will help your brain function. Check us out at heartandsoil.co. If you want to reclaim your birthright to radical health, why would you not want to do that? That is exactly what you should be doing. Cheers and howdy to all of you. In this week's episode of the podcast, I talk with my buddy, Evan Brand. He is a third-time repeat guest. We have a previous episode on mold, a previous episode on things that I can't even mention for fear this will get censored on YouTube. And we have now this episode doing a much deeper dive into mold toxicity. You guys are going to love this one. We talk about what it is, where it is, how to avoid it, how to test for it, and a bunch of other connections with other things like Candida, histamine intolerance, and whatnot. This is a really, really solid episode. Evan is an amazing guy. You can find him at his own podcast. He is a certified functional medicine practitioner and a nutritional therapy practitioner, and he has seen thousands of patients. I really appreciate his clinical experience in this, and he's an amazing human. So enjoy this one with my buddy, Evan Brand. If you like this podcast, please leave me a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This is how we spread the message to more people. This is such an important message of animal-based diets, the importance of meat, organs, fruit, honey, raw dairy. This is changing lives, you guys. Changing freaking lives. We are bucking the nutritional trends. We are explorers. We are truth seekers. And this is really how we get this out to more people. So thank you for leaving me a review. My heartfelt gratitude to you. Love you all. On to the podcast, Truth Seekers. Evan Brand, third time, brother. Welcome back to the podcast.
Dr. Paul, thanks for having me.
Every episode that we've done has been a home run with my audience. We did one on mold. We did one on some suppressed medications and a viral illness that I won't even mention for fear of this podcast getting censored. And and I really wanted to get back with you and do a final or another follow-up to the mold podcast and talk more about this because you've been doing more research on this. We've got a great set of information to present to people here. And I've gotten tons of questions about mold all the time. And I think that you are a very good person to talk to you about this because you have seen so many people with these illnesses. It's your clinical experience, I think, as a nutritional therapy practitioner, functional nutritionist. What are your credentials again? Tell me again.
Yeah, the credentials are certified functional medicine practitioner. So that's the CFMP.
Right.
And then the FNTP is the nutritional therapy part.
Right.
Which everything I learned in that doesn't apply to what I use in my life. So I'll tell you that much.
But I think that because you have those credentials, you've seen so many people over the years, and it's so valuable what you're doing, and just your clinical experience has added so much. So let's jump into a conversation about mold, and I think this conversation will take us into realms of Candida and parasites, which I've been getting a lot of questions about recently, and we'll go from there. You said you did a bunch of historical research. I hated history when I was a kid, but now that I'm a semi-adult, I say that, with a smirk, I think history is fascinating. And so tell me about this historical evidence for mold toxicity that you found. This has been around and plaguing humans for a long time.
Yeah. And first of all, I just want to celebrate the fact that you love science as much as I do, because you're one of the only podcasts out there where if you do your solo episodes, you'll go and review PubMed studies. How many people do that? Not many. So that's why I just love chatting with you, because we have so much fun together. And I did my homework. I was like, man, this is not right unless I dig into the research, because I know you have done the same. And so I've been looking at this stuff all week. And what I came across was even in we're talking over 2,000 years ago. This probably all started 10,000 BC, just like everything else that plagued humans, with the shrinking of the brain and the stature and the bones and all of the things when we transferred from hunter-gatherer to this modern human. That was a bad idea for many reasons, as you know and have educated people about for years. But apparently, this illness was called St. Anthony's fire. And this was an illness that occurred all throughout the Middle Ages, and they didn't know what the heck it was coming from, and so they were using relics and crosses and other things to try to, quote, cure people. Turns out it was mycotoxins, and people were having hallucinations, they were having depression, they were having anxiety, they were having skin issues. Then I started looking into the Salem witchcraft trials. That was always weird as a kid. I learned a little bit about that, but you look into, there's actually a journal in a dermatology article. I was trying to find it and see if I could pull it up. But essentially what happens is these grains get moldy, people eat them, and then they start tripping out because apparently ogretism can cause hallucinations. But the problem that was happening is that there were rashes popping up on the skin of these people. And they were saying, well, this was the mark of the devil. And therefore these people were put on trial. But it turns out that this rash was simply a manifestation of the mold toxicity. And here we are back to why you shouldn't eat grains. And then apparently there was a major outbreak that affected the Spartans. This was in 430 Common Era. And I tried to look into the Spartan Wars and try to learn more about it. All I could find that there was a major outbreak. And so there's this big historical change in wars. There's this big discussion about how wars were either put on hold or wars were affected due to people getting sick from mycotoxins. One study I found here was in 1772. Apparently, Russia was supposed to, it was called a Russian Tsar, Peter the Great. He tried to capture several water ports on the Black Sea from Turkey, and his soldiers were stopped in a town due to an ergo epidemic. They obtained hay for their horses and bread for themselves derived from ergo-infected rye. Man and beast were affected, destroying their ability to battle the Turks. They were forced to retreat. So when you think about the context of how people broke free from other countries and how wars were won, I mean, a lot of it has to do with us eating grain. So I could rant on that all day, but here's something that I think is more interesting in the modern context, which is pets. I know you've got your doggie down in Costa Rica. I've got a Shih Tzu, and when we were in our house, she's a 14-year-old Shih Tzu. She randomly developed a lipoma on her chest. And I thought, okay, this is strange. And I've talked with dozens and dozens of clients who randomly their dog gets cancer. And I started looking into this, and here was a study out of China. No surprise, because they are importing tons and tons and tons of moldy grains. But this was a study titled Mycotoxins in Commercial Dry Pet Food in China, and they look at all the different mycotoxins. So just as a refresher for people that maybe missed the first episode we did on it, mycotoxins are essentially, think of it like the lectin of the mold world, because mycotoxins are a defense chemical. Mycotoxins are coming off of mold. Think of it as a mold fart. Mold can't bite and it can't affect you in any other way, so it just has to poison you. And so, long story short, they did this study on dry food. 96.9% of dog food samples were contaminated by at least 3 different types of mycotoxins. And then it's worth noting that all of these samples exceeded the maximum limits set by the European Union. So, if your dog randomly gets cancer, your dog randomly gets a tumor, it could be not only from moldy dog food, or it could be that they're in a moldy environment. So our pets are a really good indicator of what could be going on. So I just encourage people, if you have a pet and they're sick and you're in the same house as that sick pet, we can't blame it all on mold, but this is certainly a fascinating piece of the puzzle.
Wow. That's super scary. And I'd heard of this St. Anthony's fire in the past and the ergotism from this ergot fungus that grows on rye when you try and ferment it. And you reminded me of this prior to the podcast. And I thought that's so interesting. And in the Salem whip trials, crazy to think that moldy grains were the cause of so many landmark events in our history as humans. But I want to emphasize the point that you were making in the beginning, which is that this is all probably a recent thing for humans. Once you start storing or growing and then storing grain is when humans get exposed to mold toxins in the food system in a much higher percentage than we were as hunter-gatherers. I'll tell you what, the Hadza, I say this on so many podcasts, but it's an important point to always repeat. They get up, they hunt, they eat the food, it's gone, it's in their belly. The longest they're keeping food around is maybe 3 or 4 days if they have a massive kill, and they're going to ferment maybe a few pieces of meat or dry it, making jerky. They're not holding any plant foods. They're certainly not storing any grains. I think that their exposure to fungus would have been much lower. But as we know, there was this thing called the Neolithic Revolution 10 to 15,000 years ago. It's not really a revolution. It was more like a de-evolution, the Neolithic devolution, where for some reason we started growing grains and pastoralism came in. Jared Diamond has famously called this the worst mistake in human history. And I think it's in the running. I think there's a lot of horrible things that have happened in human history that are major mistakes, but certainly the advent of what he calls the cult of the seed was a big one for many reasons. You touched on one of them, lectins, defense chemicals in these grains, which are seeds that clearly don't want to get eaten, but mold toxins associated this being a big part of this as well. So this is not a new problem for humans. Now, let's move on to a little bit of a rehash of something we might have talked about in the first episode, but let's talk about where humans can get exposed to mold toxins. We've touched on this a little bit with grains. Let's come back to that. I know nuts and seeds can be an issue. Anything basically stored and dried, even dried fruit can be an issue. But let's talk about other sources of mold exposure. Most people will probably be aware of this. We've done a couple of other things since the Neolithic devolution, specifically living in houses made of paper, which can be a problem. So where are people getting exposed to mold?
Yeah, in Austin, it's like one of the mold capitals. I mean, I've seen so many clients in Austin, and I don't know why. I mean, Portland, Oregon is no different. Seattle's no different in terms of the moisture level and the rain. But I think what makes Austin uniquely moldy is because there's so much heat and humidity. Versus in Portland, it's a lot cooler, right? So there's certain molds that are going to grow more in warm, humid places, like tropical molds, and then you have things that are going to grow in cooler climates. And I watched back our podcast we did first, and I said, you and I were talking about, well, where is it coming from? And I said, well, 90% is moldy buildings, water damaged buildings that people are in, whether it's an office building that you're working in, whether it's a school building that your children is attending school in, or whether it's your home. And a lot of people got sick in the past 2 years because of the pandemic. They've been at home and they're working at their home offices now. And people are realizing, wait a second, I don't feel as good as I did at the office. And commercial buildings generally are better in terms of airflow. They generally use less toxic materials because they're more, I would just say basic, like they're warehouses. And you just fill this warehouse in and turn it into an office building. Where a home, you've got kitchen cabinets that could be off-gassing. You've got floor chemicals. You've got drywall. You've got like just think of a general commercial building like a Chipotle, for example. Chipotle is relatively a mold-free building. You go in those places, they have concrete floors, they have very minimalist decor, they have stainless steel tables, they have huge windows. There's not really much for mold to grow on in a Chipotle. So that's like a mold-safe building if you want to eat out. But in your home, there's just so much more material, like your bathroom vanity. You've got a lot more indoor plumbing involved compared to your office building. Maybe your office building has a bathroom, but you don't have a kitchen sink and a dishwasher and a bar and a basement bathroom and a sump pump that can fail. And so indoor mold from a home is still probably the biggest source. But when I was doing research for this podcast, I actually found a study that tried to quantify this. And they were looking at specifically ochratoxin. Now, you and I looked at a couple of case studies last time, and we looked at ochratoxin, which is probably the most common mycotoxin that we're going to see. And this is produced by the molds Aspergillus and Penicillium. And they actually quantified this, which is pretty interesting. So they talk about the sources here. So like inhalation, right? So that would be a water damaged building, dermal contact, and then various foods. So then they go into maize or corn. So sorghum, wheat, rice, barley, rye, bread, oats, flour, pasta, grapes, infant cereals, apples, peaches, strawberries, pears, oranges, figs, mangoes, wine, tomatoes, coffee beans, watermelons, nuts, rapeseed, sesame, spice, soybeans, cocoa, peanuts, chickpeas, milk, and milk-based extra blah, blah, blah. Egg, cheese, yam, potatoes, garlic, fish, pork, poultry, jerky, dried beans. If you look at what you're eating and what you and I are promoting people to eat, we're cutting out like probably 90% of this. And I don't know too much about the watermelon. I don't really eat that much watermelon. I don't eat too many pears. If I do eat strawberries, they're fresh and I make sure that they're not moldy. But what they found is 44%. Here it is. The European Commission report estimates adult exposure to ochratoxin is as follows. They say 44% of their exposure is cereal, 10% wine, 9% coffee, 7% beer, 5% cacao, and then you're down at 3% meat, 3% spices, and 15 others. So if you're going carnivore-ish, let's just say you're doing meat, maybe you're getting a tiny 3% of that ochratoxin exposure from meat. And let's say maybe you do a little extra than Paul. I know you do salt. Maybe you're wanting to go a little crazy and go garlic or some basil. Maybe you get a little extra there. But just imagine how much less people would get exposed to. And I want to make the point that in a developed country where we have access to good quality meats, we can easily tweak our diet. But a lot of these publications are looking at India and these other very, very poor countries where grains are the staple of the diet. Rice and corn and seeds and sorghum and all this stuff. These are like the staple foods. And so that's the really concerning part is people who may never even find this podcast, those are the people that are most affected by this because the staple foods in these countries are the most contaminated foods. And so for us listening to this, we're easily able to just go, I'm done with grain, and we can cut it out. But, the people that may not ever find this, those are the ones that are being affected the most.
You were mentioning Guatemala to me earlier in the podcast. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is crazy. Let me see. I think this is the one. Yeah, this was a study. So apparently Guatemala has the most liver cancer anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And so there was a study done looking at the amount of mold exposure, or more accurately, mycotoxin exposure in these people in Guatemala. And they started looking at it. And the interesting thing is that for some reason, I don't know if it's a protective, I haven't gone into everything into the study yet, but there must be some protective mechanism that women have because the rates of liver cancer in men are significantly higher than women, but they're eating the same moldy grains. So let me see if I can just do a Control F and type in male because it was talking about, yeah, here it is. So sex differences in liver cancer are well described, and there were almost 600,000 cases among men, 250,000 among women in the latest data reported. And they're seeing the same thing in rats. They talk about sex differences, but I don't know why. I don't know if it's elevated levels in hormones. I don't know what the heck it is. But long story short, you look at this Guatemala study, and they all get to the same conclusion, which is this. Aflatoxin is the main reason for liver cancer. And this is something that when you go to your oncologist, they're not going to suggest that it's because you've been eating moldy corn tortillas your whole life. They're going to give you, I don't know what they do in Guatemala, but I'm assuming it's probably similar to the U.S. It's probably the poison, cut, and burn strategy of oncology, which is not root cause at all. It's just amazing to think about the epidemic of cancer that we're seeing. How much of that could we stop now if people just got away from these foods? Now, here was another thing, too. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I was looking into children because, I have 2 kids of my own, and I tested both of my daughters, and they did have mycotoxin exposure, probably through the placenta of my wife, also through breast milk, breastfeeding transmits mycotoxins. And I've seen a lot of children. I think we actually did a case study last time we were together about a 3-year-old who had mold toxicity, and since then, I've seen so many more children. I had a 2-year-old last week named Levi from California, who this kid, since birth, was, quote, born with allergy issues, according to the ear, nose, and throat doctor and the allergists that are working on this 2-year-old. And it turns out, which I could probably find it if you want to, I got a case study folder for him, his levels of ochratoxin are off the chart. less than a 7 on a urine sample, he's at 126, and he's only 2 years old. And so this kid who's, quote, born with allergies, he wasn't born with allergies. He was born with mycotoxins, and it came from the mom because she works in a moldy school. So when you start thinking of the multi-generational sicknesses that we're seeing, it's very cool to look at the mom and then see that she has the same mycotoxins that her 2-year-old does. And so that's interesting, but this is affecting not only our productivity in terms of fatigue and brain fog and all of that, but they've quantified this. And right here is the abstract that's important. The children that are exposed to indoor molds have triple the risk of a low IQ score. So when we think about the future of society, we want to have smart, intelligent children. It's my goal as a dad to raise kids that are smart enough to be able to help people, hopefully change the world in some way, shape, or form. But when you have these kids that are growing up, this is a study that came out of Poland. They made sure to look at all the other co-founding variables in this study. So these were all non-smoking, pregnant women. They were free of chronic diseases. They didn't have diabetes. They didn't have hypertension. And then how they quantified the mold is just visible mold, which I told my wife I was doing another podcast with you on mold, and I said, honey, what should I tell Paul and his people next time? And she goes, well, make sure to tell people that you're rarely going to see mold, because we didn't see it in our last house. We didn't smell it. We didn't see it. It was in the crawl space, and the mycotoxins were being pumped up through the ductwork. So she wanted you guys to know that you're probably not going to see it. Now, in this study, they were using visible mold patches on the walls. Now, that would be an extreme case of mold toxicity. But either way, you see the abstract there, triples the risk of a low IQ score. So when people are like, well, this isn't a big deal, this doesn't matter, this does matter. This is going to affect all of our generations. Now, I didn't pull it up. I could look in PubMed here and try to find it. But what I did find, too, is that in men, not only does mycotoxin exposure reduce testosterone, but it also reduces the quality, the quantity, and the motility of sperm. And we now have the lowest, on average for men, fertile men. Really, a lot of them are infertile, but we'll just call them fertile men, like healthy, reproductive age men. We now have on record, on paper, the lowest levels of testosterone and sperm quality and sperm quantity and sperm motility ever in the history of recording this. And I think it's directly attributed to mycotoxins as one major piece of the puzzle. Now, obviously, there's xenoestrogens and synthetic plastics, but we talked about this a little bit last time. The mycotoxin zearalenone, which comes from fusarium, which is an extremely common mold in grains, in corn, in rice, in beans, in nuts, and in water-damaged buildings. It is far more estrogenic than plastics. So plastics get the bad rap, but really zearalenone is far more estrogenic than the plastics, which is directly impacting our testosterone levels, which you and I could go really deep into this if you want to, but I think the direction society is headed is directly attributed to the average male having such low testosterone levels.
Oh my God. Man, so much there.
Here was another one that I pulled up just on canine mammary tumors is their association, and they so for the study, 168 samples of feed offered to dogs were analyzed for the presence of aflatoxins, fumonisin, and zearalenone. Mycotoxins were found in all samples, 100%.
Oh, man. Yeah, thanks for circling back to the dog food stuff. As you mentioned, I do have a dog in Costa Rica. His name's Ribeye, for anyone that doesn't know. I frequently post pictures and photos of him in my stories on social media. And one of the reasons that I wanted to build a pet food company, which is in the works, guys. We're building the best pet food on the planet. Believe me, it's completely animal-based. Yeah, it's coming. It's coming. Yeah. We're making the pet food. The pet food is all animal-based. It's all animal products. It's no Satel. There's no moldy grains. We'll definitely test it for mold. But one of the reasons that I wanted to build a pet food company was I got this dog, and we're going to make dog and cat food. So that's future planning.
Is this the first time you've announced this?
I think I've mentioned it on social media a little bit, but it's coming. Yeah, it's just this is a very apropos moment to do it. Was that I got this dog, and I'm thinking, what am I going to feed this dog? And in Costa Rica, I have a guy that works at my house. We're doing renovations, and he brought some dog food, and I was like, we're not feeding ribeye this garbage. It was just this Purina bullshit stuff, and I was like, we're never feeding him that ever. And so since the day that I've had him, and he was a rescue, so he was probably a few months old when I got him, he's only had meat and organs and bone meal. He gets supplements from Heart and Soil, but he gets fresh organs and raw meat. He is the healthiest dog I've ever seen in my life. His coat is amazing. His teeth are totally pearly white. It's incredible. But I hear of people's dogs, and I hear of people similarly having cancers and things like this. And you think, oh man, how much of this is preventable? How much of this is related to mold toxins? And I love that you started off this podcast with that study showing that while you can find mold toxins in almost every single food that humans will eat, the majority of the foods that are contaminated with mold toxins are foods that are excluded on an animal-based, aka carnivore-ish diet. Cereal grains are the first. There's wine, there's coffee. People ask me all the time. I'm not a fan of those foods at all for that reason and many others. And I would wonder, it said 3% meat, but it also included, dried meats and beef jerkies on there too. So I've got to think that fresh meat probably isn't going to have many mold toxins on it at all. I'm skeptical of that number, even from the outset. But I also wanted to mention that I know a woman who had a miscarriage due to what appears to be ergotism, so ergot fungus in rye. Her boyfriend was fermenting rye, I think, to make some sort of sourdough bread, and they ate it, and she tragically had a miscarriage. So I've even heard of a person having significant symptoms related to this, and we know these ergot funguses and the mycotoxins they produce are abortive facins, abortive molecules, as are many plant defense chemicals in general, something I can talk about more in the future. So the dog food, the pet food thing is coming, guys. We're going to improve on that. But these grains are a major, major problem for humans. It's crazy to think about liver cancers in these developing countries that are mostly grain-based. People always also ask me, what about rice? To which I will say, if you're going to eat a grain, white rice is probably the least offensive, but it's not an ideal food for humans, in my opinion. It's definitely going to have mycotoxins. You can perhaps mitigate some of that in rice with pressure cooking white rice, but how many people are actually going to pressure cook their white rice? I think the less grains you eat, the better, and that is a big improvement in human health. Again, these grains contain defense chemicals, and they are contributing to many other issues with these associated mycotoxins. What have you got here for us?
Yeah, check this out. Mycotoxins have caused many serious outbreaks worldwide. There was an outbreak that occurred in 1967 and 26 people were poisoned. Now, keep in mind, there's a big difference between acute mycotoxin poisoning and chronic. So primarily what we're seeing and what we're going to see, like if you're working with some type of a functional medicine practitioner, if they're testing you for mycotoxins to help investigate the root cause of your autoimmune disease or your fatigue problems or your mitochondrial issues or your depression or your anxiety. That's more of a chronic exposure, but in a very, very high level. If you get this big bolus of a moldy food, you can get acutely sick also. So this is talking about a study that was done, I guess this happened in 67, where consumption of moldy rice for up to 3 weeks in Taiwan, 26 people were poisoned. An outbreak of toxicosis affecting humans reported in India. It killed 100 people in 1974. Another outbreak in 95 affected over 1,400 people due to sorghum and maize contaminated with fumonisin. And then in 2004, another outbreak in Kenya killed another 125 people. I also read something about, let me see if I can do a control F on turkey. Not the country, but the animal. Yeah, here it was. So apparently there was 100,000 turkeys that were killed in London, England, due to a peanut meal imported from Brazil, which had metabolites from aspergillus, which would be aflatoxins. So this affects livestock too, which is another reason why we need to stop growing soy. We need to stop growing corn. We need to take back the United States of America, and we need to do forest grazing. I just got a new magazine in the other day. I subscribed to a few different like homestead type magazines, and it was this article all about this forest agriculture and how there's these comparisons being done of soy and corn, these fields that are being converted back in and just growing wild, where the bushes and the trees can come back in, and just what that's doing in terms of reduction in erosion and, of course, increase in nutrient density. I was looking at Brazil. I'm sure you know this already, but they have soy alone, just that one crop, the size of California can fit into Brazil, and that's just soy alone. It's unreal what's happening. And I kind of got on a tangent about the crops for a second, but we were talking about men and testosterone. So I want to make sure that I don't forget to mention females. I don't market myself as a fertility functional medicine practitioner, but I've had dozens of women that have been able to have babies by simply going on a carnivore-ish diet and detoxing their bodies of mycotoxins. So when you look at this chart here, for people that are on audio, I'm sorry, you're missing out on a lot of visuals, so maybe refer to this video. But when you look at the different mycotoxins, not only are they carcinogenic, but they also affect the immune system. All of them are considered immunotoxic. Some of them are specifically toxic to the kidneys, like ochratoxin. Many of them are neurotoxins as well, which is probably why we're seeing the reduced IQ in children exposed to moldy buildings. But then also, you have issues with fertility in women, and also this teratogenic effect, meaning that it's going to affect a fetus. And so there are millions of children being born with mycotoxins in their bodies because of their mother having their own mold exposure during their lifetime, or these children being born into moldy environments. And so women that are told they can't have children, they need to investigate mycotoxins. This is very important. You can do a simple urine test at home. It's a fasted urine sample. And if you find elevated levels of mycotoxins, you have to realize, like we talked about with zearalenone, this is going to affect your estrogen levels. And so if you have PMS, if you have irritability, if you have anxiety, if you have low self-esteem, if you're a chronic worrier, that is directly correlated to issues with not only serotonin, which you can measure on urine, but also your mycotoxin load. And so these women that come to me that are 40, 42, they feel like this biological clock is ticking, they want to have children. The first thing I do is run urine on them and look at mycotoxins. The funny thing is, half the time, these women get pregnant in the middle of a protocol. I tell them, like, look, hold on, let's detox you first before you get pregnant, before you start trying, give me a few months, let me work on you. And then they get pregnant in the middle of the protocol, which is exciting. And in many cases, we can continue gentle, safe binders throughout pregnancy to ensure. There was actually a study done, I could pull it up if you want, but it was on chlorella. And chlorella has been shown to reduce the transfer of toxins to the fetus. So the cool thing is, if a woman is currently pregnant listening to this and she wants to improve the health of her child and reduce the risk of cancers and other issues in her child, she can take binders during pregnancy to reduce that transfer to the baby. And that also was shown to reduce the transfer via breast milk. So if you can bind up these toxins, you still want to breastfeed your baby. You don't want them drinking friggin' corn syrup garbage formula. You want breast milk. You can make that breast milk healthier.
So cool. I'm thinking of Heidi Montag, who came on the podcast a few weeks ago. Heidi's trying to get pregnant. She has one son named Gunnar. Heidi is from the Hills, a show that I didn't watch, but she and Spencer are really, really cool people, Spencer Pratt, in the Hollywood area. And I'm going to send Heidi this podcast for sure, because she's trying to get pregnant. I think she's improving her fertility by doing an animal-based diet. She's cutting out all of these high mold foods, but we should probably definitely get her tested with a urine test to see if she's exposed anywhere else.
Do you know how old she is?
She's probably in her mid-30s.
Okay, so she's got plenty of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Pause 1 sec. Evan, there's a candle here at the CEO's desk that smells like shit.
No problem.
I can't deal with this.
A synthetic fragrance candle?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
I don't know what it's doing. I'm going to go throw it in the forest.
Oh, folks, if he doesn't cut this out of the podcast, I'll rant on some synthetic fragrances for a minute. Synthetic fragrances are highly estrogenic. Believe it or not, if you look into fragrances are a conglomeration of tens of thousands of various chemicals, and companies can use the term fragrance and they can hide all sorts of endocrine disrupting chemicals in the term fragrance. So if you've not already, please get rid of your fragrances. It'll improve your hormones. It'll improve your brain. Paul, I'm ranting on fragrances. I said if he doesn't cut this out of the podcast, I'm going to rant on fragrances.
We'll leave it in. I love it. We'll leave it in.
Okay, so here's what I was saying. That synthetic fragrances, that term fragrance, they can hide tens of thousands of different chemicals under the term fragrance. And inside of most fragrances, there are endocrine disruptors, which negatively impact testosterone. It affects estrogen metabolism. So women, men, both of you, you're getting poisoned by synthetic fragrances. So if you've not already, you got to get rid of your scented laundry detergent. You got to get rid of dryer sheets. You got to go 100% free and clear. Now, if you want to do essential oils like in a soap, or, I have a candle right here on my desk, but these are citrus oils that denature mold and denature Candida. So these actually have a therapeutic benefit for your breathable air. But beyond that, you don't want to be using synthetic fragrances at all. Your soaps, your conditioners, we're bathed in this stuff. Everywhere you look, there's fragrance. You know how hard it is to find fragrance-free products? Well, it used to be harder. Now it's a lot easier, but people still use it too much.
Oh, man. This podcast is already better now that I threw that candle in the garbage. A couple of thoughts on things we've already covered, and then we can go on to testing. We mentioned this a little bit, but how people can know how mold toxic they are. Testosterone, crazy to think about the combination of xenoestrogens, phytoestrogens. So xenoestrogens are things like plastics, BPA, other bisphenols, bisphenol E, bisphenol C, S, whatever. Plant estrogens, phytoestrogens, things like soy, and then also this combination of mold toxins, zearalenone from fumonisin mold, right?
Fumonisin? Yeah. So fumonisins. Yeah, fusarium is the mold, and it can make different mycotoxins. Yeah.
Yep. And if you look at this, I've talked about this study a couple of times in Loma Linda. This is a community of Seventh-day Adventists, and this population has a higher rate of veganism and vegetarianism due to their religious preferences. I've done a long ago previous podcast with a gentleman talking about the historical background of Seventh-day Adventist movement and the fact that cornflakes are essentially created by Harvey Kellogg to chemically castrate people and quell carnal libidinous desires. So cornflakes do a fantastic job of that, probably because they are so nutrient poor and because they're going to bathe you and everything about you in mold toxins. So cornflakes is the perfect antidote to your libido. If you actually want to be a healthy human and you would like a libido and you want to have healthy, responsible sexual relations with other healthy, responsible, aware humans, then you probably want to avoid things like cornflakes or other grains. But the population in Loma Linda has very, very poor sperm quality, probably because of this combination of both plant pesticides, exogenous synthetic pesticides going on plants, and mold toxins in the foods they are eating. You've got something pulled up here.
Yeah, and like I said in the beginning, this is why I love doing podcasts with you, because everybody else would be so bored by now with these studies, but you love this stuff. And so when people say things like mycotoxins affect fertility, that's a pretty bold statement. And we're talking about testosterone, but there's papers on this. This is a paper all about the effects of mycotoxins on the actual endocrine system. And it just breaks this down. Ochratoxin, it shows, which this gets a little geeky even over my head, phosphorylation of P13K. I don't know what they're talking about there, but all I do know is that when you're looking at zearalenone, it's talking about here spermatogenesis. You talk about male fertility being affected. It talks about the Sertoli cells. Yeah, here they are. Zearalenone is an estrogenic mycotoxin, damages the Sertoli cells and may induce apoptosis. And so the Sertoli cells, that is what forms the testes and creates spermatogenesis. So that's crazy. So I just wanted to just go a little deeper, because when you say mycotoxins affect fertility, it's like, well, how? And I think it's a multi-combination answer, right? It's affecting the hormones, but then it's also affecting your testicles that are making your sperm.
Yeah, that's where the testosterone in the sperm is made, in the late egg and the Sertoli cells in the testicle, and it can be directly toxic to that. And I'm sure it will affect oogenesis and the cells making eggs too, which will affect progesterone and estrogen and all that stuff for women as well. A couple other things that I wanted to mention. I was puzzling this in my head as you were showing one of the early studies talking about mold contamination in meat. And I'm thinking, why would meat have mold contamination? And then, of course, the light bulb goes on as you continue talking, and you're talking about the peanut meal that's contaminated with aflatoxin, contaminating turkey meat. And I'm thinking, oh, of course, I don't eat any meat that's not grass-fed and grass-finished, but the majority of people on the planet are still eating mostly grain-finished beef. That is where the mold contamination is coming from in meat or beef or turkey or chicken or pork. So let's bring it back full circle, guys. Like, you should be eating animals that are eating a species appropriate diet. The whole point of all of the work that I do is to help us understand and to continue thinking and asking questions about what a species appropriate diet for humans is. I happen to believe it's an animal-based diet of organs, meat, fruit, honey, more recently raw dairy. But these things are going to have mold toxins in them. The meat is going to have mold toxins in it if it is fed grains. So yet another reason not to eat grain-fed meat. And then as you were going through that early study as well, I was thinking, why is milk contaminated with mold toxins? Of course, most milk is from cows that are fed grains. So if you are eating cheese, I'm a huge fan of raw dairy. If you are eating milk, I'm a huge fan of raw dairy, but that probably doesn't go far enough. You want to be eating these foods from animals that are fed grass, that are fed good foods, that are not fed moldy grains. So you can go very far down this rabbit hole if we want to, and take it in stride, guys. Don't get overwhelmed. But in Costa Rica, I've been very fortunate to get access to a raw goat milk. And I know the guy that makes the goat milk. He's not feeding the goats moldy grains, but you need to know your farmers. If you're getting raw milk, great. Presumably, if somebody's making raw milk, they're going to be feeding the cows grass. But if you're getting raw milk from a cow that's fed grains, that's still a problem. It's still going to be a much smaller exposure to mycotoxins than a cereal grain, I think, based on the studies that you were showing, Evan. But I want people to be aware of this, that if you are eating grain-fed meat, here's another reason to avoid grain-fed meat. And if you're eating grain-fed dairy or any of these animal products, butter, whatever, even tallow from a grain-fed animal is going to be accumulating mold toxins. People will often say they're the same. There's no big deal with grass-fed. Why should I pay extra? You should pay extra to protect you and your family from freaking mold toxins.
No joke. I mean, here's the thing though, like we're having all this like scientific talk and look at this study that says this and look at this study that says that. But it's like, duh, we screwed everything up with agriculture. Like if we were just living like modern hunter-gatherers, we wouldn't even need to have this discussion. And I know we can't fully go back to that way, but I just want people to think about what are the strategies in my day-to-day life, like getting more fresh air. I mean, people that are working from home now, if you look at, and I hate to say the word study again, but if you look at studies on people and how much time they spend inside, it's like 96% of the day is spent inside. So what is one simple modern hunter-gatherer way to reduce your mycotoxin exposure if you're in a moldy office? Get outside. And maybe you have the ability, maybe the weather's decent enough to where you can work outside. Maybe you can do your phone call outside. I remember when we were in our house, we were in the middle of remediation, and I had a 1-hour new client call, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to go out in the woods. And there was a snowstorm that just happened. It was one of the most memorable consults I've ever had in my life. I had my headset in, and I was literally just walking, crunching through the snow in the forest while on the call. And I thought, my God, why didn't I do this more often? Now, I was a bit distracted by the birds and stuff, but I was like, wow, this is so easy. This is a simple step that other people could be doing. Have that business call under a tree, outside. Like, if you absolutely have to be in this paper box, fine. But what about if you could crack your window open and just dilute some of this exposure? Like you mentioned with the dairy, I like some raw dairy too, but I'm not going to eat it unless it's a grass-fed dairy. And I want to talk about one thing too, and I was thinking about this. Why are so many people being drawn to what you're doing? Why are so many people now finding that this animal-based lifestyle is this magic miracle solution? And why are so many people now at such an extreme level of misery with their symptoms that the level of desperation, they're willing to go all in? And I think it's just the conglomeration of all of this. I think it's 30 to 40 years of people eating moldy grains. I think it's people that have their hormones disrupted from drinking out of plastic their whole life and living in this paper box and being in the city and breathing in air pollution. I mean, look at cortisol samples of people that live in the city versus cortisol samples of people that live in the rural area where they have more trees and greenery to look at. The cortisol samples in the countryside are always lower. So these people now, look at the population, the vast majority, over 2/3 of the world's population now lives in urban areas. We are leaving and losing what humankind is built to be exposed to. When I go into the city, we have some trees, but it's not the same experience. You have a lack of birds. They've done GPS tracking on birds, and all the birds are moving out of the cities because they're losing their ability to express their full birdness. And this human zoo that we've created, that is the problem. And so not only from the air pollution aspect, but the lack of the greenery, the exposure to more buildings, the lack of this outdoor fresh air. So I know I could go so many directions, but I'm just thinking out loud.
I love it, man. I love it. Birds losing their birdness, humans losing our humanness. There was one other point I wanted to make before we get any further in the podcast. You were talking about the soy, the sheer volume, the sheer area, of land in Brazil that is occupied by soy. So this is something I learned. I live in Central America now. I live in Costa Rica. I say that proudly. I live in a house that's mostly open air. We've talked about this. It's mostly concrete. I have a great lifestyle there, which is pretty darn low mold. I get grass-fed meat. And I posted about the bounty of an animal-based diet on social media. I had a team down there with me recently doing some filming. We put this huge spread on the table, the concrete sort of center of my kitchen. And it was all these fruit and all these organs. And someone commented and said, you are eating food grown on a farm, and that farm is the cause of rainforest deforestation. And I thought, okay, this is a super important point to address because it is part of a plant-based rhetoric, which gets repeated too many times, and it is patently false. So in Amazonia, in Central America, in Brazil, in South America, if you clear land, if you clear the rainforest, you have rights to that land. You can essentially own land by clearing the rainforest. This is what people in Amazonia, Central America, South America know. So what is a farmer going to think? Like, well, if I clear this plot of rainforest, if I can find some way to clear it, this is now my land. So what do? They cut down the rainforest and they bring in cattle, because cattle do a good job of kind of clearing out the underbrush. But they're not clearing the rainforest to grow cattle. They're clearing the rainforest to grow soy. So this is the problem. And this gets repeated so often, Evan, that yes, except they're saying soy and cattle team up to drive deforestation in South America, but they're using the cattle, but the ultimate goal is to grow soy. They don't want to grow cattle on this land. They want to grow soy. So the cows are not deforesting the rainforest. Soy is deforesting the rainforest because the people are trying to get this land. So it's these policies. It's governmental policy in Amazonia that is saying, hey, if you clear this rainforest, you can have it. Well, people are all too happy to clear that rainforest. So cows are not driving rainforest deforestation in any way, shape, or form. And that piece of information is super important for anyone listening to this podcast to be equipped with, because this will come up in common conversation and you will now be much more informed than anyone else you are talking to. And that is very valuable because we need to educate the public and all people in all walks of life that, hey, cows are not the problem. It's usually grains.
Yeah, Paul, with you living in Central America, you will love Manga Bay. I look at a ton of stuff about them. I love jaguars. I love to read how the jaguar population is doing in Central America and South America. I love reading about, the restoration of the habitat. They're seeing the jaguars migrate up through Mexico now. We've even seen a possible jaguar getting back into the United States. I love keeping up with wildlife and all of that. But, they do post some like conservation stuff. Yeah, I don't know why they put cattle in the title of that article, because it is kind of wrong. But then if you look at the second bullet point, they talk about how soybean farms are typically planted in old cattle pastures. And so they're still, like, even if cattle were there, now they're replacing what the cattle were using with soy. So yeah, it's just bad. And then what's the issue with soy? I mean, how does that connect to what we're talking about? Well, because a lot of times the soy that's going into the chicken or the soy that's going into the turkey, that's going to change the nutrient density, the nutrient profile of that. Now, I can't directly say that if you eat a chicken that ate soy that you're going to grow man boobs. But I tell you, that's not a species appropriate diet for a chicken. If you have chickens, I tell you what they eat. They eat earthworms, they eat crickets, they like grasshoppers, they love mealworms, they like berries. They're not eating soy. Oh my God, if I put a chicken out in a soy field, do you think they're going to go eat those soy leaves? No way, they're not going to touch it. Maybe if they're starving, but I tell you, they're going to go for the mealworms. They're going to go for a more omnivorous type diet. They're going to eat like earthworms.
This is such an important point, Evan. And people will ask me in the comments on Instagram, what about chicken? What about turkey? What about pork? And I've said this before, but I'll repeat it for new listeners in the podcast. I'm not as much a fan of chicken, pork, turkey, duck because of this, because these animals are fed grains. They're going to be higher in aflatoxin, in other zearalenone, in other mycotoxins, because this grain is accumulating mold, and that is going to bioaccumulate in these animals. So I choose to make the majority of my diet ruminants, and those are cloven hoof animals, deer, elk, bison, cow. The majority of what I eat these days is beef. If I can get bison, I'll eat it. If I can get deer, if I can get elk, I'll eat all those things. But these animals are different. These animals, you can get them from farms like White Oak Pastures, from companies like Force of Nature. These are going to be great sources of grass-finished meat that is eating a species-appropriate diet. If you're eating chicken for the majority of your diet, that chicken is fed corn and soy. And if you can find corn and soy-free chicken, they're probably still fed grains. All those grains are going to be moldy, and they're going to accumulate mold toxins. And I'll just add this little story. When this podcast gets released, today is the day, February 8th, that the new cookbook comes out. So if you guys skip the intro, here's the plug for the cookbook. The Carnivore Code cookbook is out now. I wrote this as an animal-based cookbook: organs, meat, fruit, honey, raw dairy. I wrote it with Ashley and Sarah Armstrong. They helped me develop all the recipes. Ashley and Sarah Armstrong have a farm in, I believe it's Iowa, called Angel Acres. And they've actually done some really cool experiments with their chickens, Evan. You'll appreciate this. They feed their chickens earthworms, crickets. They've changed the diet of their chickens, and they looked at the linoleic acid amount in the egg yolks. What do they find? When you change a chicken's diet, the linoleic acid content of the egg yolk is much lower. You mentioned placental transfer or breast milk transfer to infants of mycotoxins. Mothers can also transfer linoleic acid to their infants, and they will transfer linoleic acid, this 18 carbon polyunsaturated fatty acid. A whole podcast on seed oils will be out in a week or two, guys. I did this with Nick Bear while I was here in Texas, and I've done many podcasts on seed oils. If you have questions, you can always email the team at Heart and Soil, radicalhealth@heartandsoil.co. You can send me a DM on Instagram, and I'll try to get to all those. But linoleic acid is another problematic molecule for humans, fat molecule. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole today in this podcast, but that can also get transferred through the breast milk. And if you survey general standard American diet eating women and you look at their breast milk when they're breastfeeding, when they're postpartum, you will find levels of linoleic acid that are much higher than the breast milk of hunter-gatherers. So what do we use to make infant formula? We use the standard levels of linoleic acid. So all of our babies from mothers who can't breastfeed or choose not to breastfeed are being fed formulas which are extra high in linoleic acid. We're being given eggs that are extra high in linoleic acid because they're eating corn and soy. And that is totally parallel to this, I would say, evolutionarily inappropriate consumption of grains by these monogastric animals, chicken, pork, turkey, etc., duck, leading to elevated levels of linoleic acid in the fat, elevated levels of linoleic acid in the muscle tissue, elevated levels of linoleic acid in the eggs, and that parallels very closely with the mycotoxins. So it's just a really interesting story when you think about it all.
Well, what's crazy too is a lot of women now are being told that their babies are allergic to their milk and just these other weird things. And so many women now, they don't even try to breastfeed anymore. They just put these kids directly on formula. And even the best organic baby formula that you can find at Whole Foods is still garbage, completely garbage. You mentioned meats, and I want to say this because I think it's a small percentage of your listeners, but it's still, there are people out there because I've had clients like this that have alpha-gal syndrome. So if I may, I want to spend a few minutes giving hope to people that are listening to you, and they're like, God dang it, look at all this grass-fed beef Paul eats. I can't friggin' eat it because I have alpha-gal syndrome. So alpha-gal is caused by the Lone Star tick. And the Lone Star tick has made it as far as Maine. And I know this because I have clients in Maine that were bitten by the Lone Star tick, and they now have what's called alpha-gal syndrome, which is where you have anaphylactic reactions to red meat. And these people are listening to you and they love you, and they can't do what you're telling them to do because they have alpha-gal. The good news is, and I've had people do this, so I can tell you this with extreme confidence that it works. There is a particular acupuncture called SAAT, Solomon Auricular Allergy Treatment, that completely cures alpha-gal. And I've had people that were hunters that loved hunting and eating elk. They got bit by the Lone Star tick. They developed alpha-gal syndrome. They then had anaphylactic, life-threatening reactions to red meat. They no longer ate red meat. They were living on chicken and turkey, the best they could find, but their health never fully thrived because it was all this corn-fed, soy-fed chicken, turkey, and they want to go back to red meat. So they went and got the Solomon Auricular Allergy Treatment. It was created by a guy, Nader Solomon. He was a pioneer in this auricular, meaning in the ear, acupuncture. I believe they leave these needles in your ear for about 3 days. Don't quote me on that. But it's been a complete reversal of alpha-gal syndrome. So for those of you listening, you want to get on red meat, but you can't because you got a tick bite, and this is not a rare situation. The Lone Star tick is spreading like wildfire. It's all over Texas, hence the Lone Star name. Luckily, I had a Lone Star tick on me. I got it off before it bit me, but they are here in Kentucky in huge numbers, and I love being in the woods. Some of my best memories in my life are being in the woods. On my property, the Lone Star ticks are everywhere, so I've got to constantly be on alert for these bad boys.
Wow, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, because I definitely get questions in my DMs and through all the channels about alpha-gal, and my response was, well, I'm not sure what to do. Maybe it goes by, maybe it reverses over time. In that case, chicken and turkey are all you've got. But as we're talking about, those are not the best options for a lot of people. Red meat is clearly better. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. So you've actually had clients use this. I've never heard of this auricular acupuncture treatment, but you've had clients use this and have reversal so that they can actually eat red meat again.
Literally complete reversal.
Wow.
In 2 sessions of this acupuncture.
I'll have to look into it more. I can't imagine leaving needles in my ears for 3 days. I usually am like a side sleeper, so I'd have to sleep on my back for 3 days. I don't know how I would do this.
I think they're really tiny and they're really like short, and then I think they put a piece of tape over it.
Wow.
Yeah, I need to try to look into let me see if I can pull up something on so apparently there's some sort of allergy zone within the ear system that this acupuncturist discovered, and so that's how you can clear the allergen.
Amazing. I'll let you look at that.
Yeah, it's one tiny needle is placed for a specific allergy. They can treat up to 3 to 4 different allergens at the same time. The needle is covered with a medical adhesive tape and worn for 3 weeks. Okay, I got it wrong. It's 3 weeks. That's a long time. But it sounds like it's a tiny needle and it's covered with tape, so it probably won't bother you.
Wow, that's amazing. I'll have to look into that more. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So we've talked about building contamination. We talked about food contamination. If people are wondering how mold toxic they may be, how much exposure, let's just walk people through this. We talked about it in the first episode. Let's talk a little bit about urine testing. Mention ERMI for me, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I did a podcast with our buddy Anthony, and he apparently emailed his newsletter about mold. And it's Gustin, right? There's not an L.
No, it's Gustin.
It's Gustin. Okay, so Anthony Gustin. So you've interviewed Anthony. You went to Africa together, which was awesome. I love the podcast you guys did where you were sitting, I think you were like sitting on your patio or something in Costa Rica. You were recording it with like your laptop microphone or something.
Yeah.
I loved it. I listened to every second of it. And so Anthony, he bought this farm property in Texas and apparently was restoring this old farmhouse, and he ran an ERMI on it, and he sent me the test results and wanted me to look at it and help him. It was one of the highest levels I've ever seen. I've rarely seen an ERMI of a 20, which is extremely dangerous. Like, evacuate immediately. No human being should be in that environment with an ERMI score of a 20. And so you may see the term ERMI, you may see the term hurts me, but these are essentially different samples that you take from around the home. So you may get like a rag or a swab or a napkin, and you'll go wipe the ductwork. You'll go like wipe the intake vent, or wipe the vent in your bathroom, or wipe your countertop. You go and you gather dust from different surfaces in the home, and then you put it into a Ziploc bag and you get it back to the lab. Mycometrics is a company that does a lot of those. And then they give you a score, which is like a health score, essentially. And Anthony's level of a 20 was insanely high. And so apparently he emailed all of his followers about it. And apparently he got the most response of anything he's ever talked about was mold. So when I say this is an epidemic problem, I'm serious, because I'm seeing it, I'm testing it. Everywhere we see there's mold problems. And it turns out it was from one of the issues in his house, in particular, this farmhouse, was the type of foundation. And I didn't know about this before he told me about it, but it was called like a pier and beam foundation, where essentially the house is kind of floating on stilts, and there's just like some metal skirting around the perimeter of the house. And so under your house is completely open air. It's not like a crawl space where you have like concrete walls or concrete block, but it's literally just open air, and there's just a tiny little piece of like aluminum around the perimeter of your house. But underneath it's a dirt floor, and you've got all this moisture, you've got all this mold that's going to go up into your subfloor, and depending on how your ductwork is run, obviously that's going to suck all that mold and pump it directly into the home. And so I don't know what he's going to do long term. We're kind of talking about it, but anyway, that's the ERMI is a home test, okay? And then you can also do Petri dishes, which you and I reviewed, and Petri dishes are cheap, they're easy, and they're effective. So we have children who are sick with mold, take it to their school, we have them put it on the floor for an hour, you put the lid on, you get it back to the lab, and then we get a health score as well, and we're looking for single digits. Many children are 20, 30, 40, 50 colonies of mold growing in their school classrooms. We try to talk with the teachers. We try to get the teachers to burn some of my Oasis candles, which are citrus oils, which are designed to actually denature the mold, so it'll make it non-viable. But some of the teachers say no. Some of the clients we work with are teachers, and so they're cool because they'll bring in air purifiers to filter this stuff. They'll bring in candles to burn. They'll mist their classroom with the citrus oils to try to treat it. But ultimately, if you've got a water-damaged building, you've got to cut this stuff out. So I encourage people, because one of my staff members, she got very sick. Her and her fiance both got very sick, and they have a daughter together now. Her daughter just turned 1 year old, and she has extremely high, unfortunately, the highest level of Roridin and Verrucarin, which are mycotoxins from Stachybotrys. This is the famous black mold, because babies, they crawl on the floor, and Stachybotrys makes very heavy mycotoxins. It's a very heavy mold, and so her and her fiance, their levels were very low because they're standing up in the home, right? And so they're not breathing it in, but the baby who's crawling on the floor is going to get more contaminated. And so where was I going with this? Well, I guess it was, okay, so here was the point. The point was that here she is working with me, and she's helping clients as well. She knows all this stuff, but she was in a rush. The real estate market's crazy in Texas, and so she just signs the contract and doesn't do any mold inspection at all. And I tell her, Megan, you've got to test this place. Texas is moldy. Do the Petri dishes. I don't have time. I'm out of town. I'm busy working, da-da-da. The inspection period closes. Guess what? She moves into an extremely moldy home on a slab. The slab was cracked. Water was leaking up from the ground through the slab. Completely had to gut the house. She spent over $20,000 to remediate it, and they're still not fully out of the woods. And so I encourage people, if you're renting, you're limited in what you can do. You can do like citrus oil fog machine treatments. I have the candles that we can burn. But if you're renting, your options are kind of limited. I have had some people that we've written letters for to get them out of a lease early, because I directly correlated the mold in the rental home to the mycotoxin in the urine. So we've used that to get people out of leases in some cases. But if you're going to buy a home, do some testing first. Do an ERMI, do the Petri dishes, because I mean, the average home now in Austin is over $500,000, the average home price. So if you're going to go spend $500,000, please spend a couple $100 on some damn mold testing, and make sure that you're not bringing you and your family into an environment that's going to make you sick, because it's much easier to prevent this stuff than to treat this stuff. Once your immune system is pissed off. And once you develop histamine intolerance, once you develop what's called MCAS or mast cell activation as a byproduct of being exposed to these toxins, it's much harder. And once you've been sensitized to this stuff, I don't want to say you can't ever fully recover, but once that door's been broken in your immune system, I suspect most people are going to be always sensitive to mold.
I don't doubt it. Got a friend here in Texas who just moved from New York. I think it's an upgrade for her. She's very mold sensitive, has a history of mold exposures from New York and other places in her life. She was looking at apartment complexes here, and they all had ERMIs. The lowest one she got was a 6.2 or a 6.8 was the lowest one she could find. These are new builds, and she decided to move into one with a 6 to 7 and clean it, use dehumidifiers and air filters. But this stuff's important. If you're renting, definitely do an ERMI on the place you're going to rent. Know what levels. I mean, my impression is that a 6 is not even ideal, that she'd want something less than like a 2 or a 3. Is that what people should be looking for on an ERMI?
You're exactly right. ERMI less than 2, that's what Dr. Richie Shoemaker, he's a medical doc who really kind of pioneered a lot of the conventional mold treatment. Now, I don't really do conventional mold treatment. That's cholestyramine, which damages the mitochondria, damages the gut and other things. So I prefer the natural functional route. But he's the guy who really got mold into the conversation. And yeah, he says that most people won't get well unless they're in an ERMI of a 2 or less.
Which has got to be pretty hard to find in general. I will say that I've looked at Shoemaker's protocols quite a bit, and I'm a little skeptical. Some of them are pretty intense. So that's my 2 cents on the Shoemaker protocol. I'm not sure people should be using vasopressin and cholestyramine long-term. I have a lot of friends that have been on cholestyramine intermittently. Cholestyramine is a bile acid sequestrant. You need your bile acids to absorb fat-soluble vitamins, guys. So anything that sequesters bile acids, I did a bullshit video on Instagram about psyllium husks. Psyllium husks are going to sequester bile acids. If anything that you're eating reduces LDL in the gut, it's probably doing it by binding bile acids. So if you are thinking of a food that reduces LDL, it is either going to have a statin in it, and there is a statin. You know the story, don't you? That one of the statins, in fact, the first statin is from a mold. It's from a red rice yeast. This is a statin. That's where they found the first statin. The first statin is a mold toxin. A mycotoxin is the molecule that statins, these HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors, are based on. So people will take this, they'll literally take red rice yeast, and they will use that as a supplement to lower their LDL, quote, naturally. They're taking a mycotoxin, which is inhibiting an essential enzyme in human biochemistry. It's always felt completely absurd to me, but these things are, it's just, that's not the way to treat it. You need to get the root cause of your metabolic dysfunction if we're talking about LDL, but know that these mold toxins are ubiquitous. In the space that you're in, you should be very careful and test it if you want to be, I think, most assured that you're in a space that's healthy.
Paul, you educated me. I did not know. I know about red yeast rice. I mean, every supplement company out there makes a red yeast rice product because there's people that say, I want an alternative to a conventional statin. I did not friggin' know there were mycotoxins. Yeah, I mean, there's a paper right here on it. This is all. I didn't know this. Yeah, dietary supplements based on red yeast rice, a source of citrinin. Now, citrinin is a very common mycotoxin. We see this a lot, and the levels are off the chart in almost every human being. So citrinin comes from different types of mold. So it's not just one mold, but citrinin is made by several. But yeah, if you look up red yeast rice and mycotoxins, this is crazy. Here's another one. Red rice yeast supplements raise mycotoxin contamination issues. And what did it say? It said something. How many of them were? Yeah, it said something. It was like all of them. Basically, all of them were contaminated.
Well, of course they're all going to be contaminated because that's the nature of this beast.
Holy smokes.
This is a mold. Yeah.
I just thought it was red yeast rice. I didn't know that it was a mycotoxin problem. Good Lord.
Yeah.
Can you believe this?
Yeah. It's a big deal. They actually then purified this statin, and cholesterol companies have now, or pharmaceutical companies have now you can get a prescription for the statin that occurs in red yeast rice. I've heard it said both ways, red rice yeast, red yeast rice, who knows? It's lovastatin. They call it monocolin K, but lovastatin is a mycotoxin that occurs in rice. If people thought that statins were good, remember, this is a mycotoxin originally. Like the yeast, this mold figured out, hey, if we inhibit HMG-CoA reductase, we can mess up animals' biochemistry and their hormonal functioning. And this is the same. This is the same pattern we see across many of these plant defense chemicals. They are often then adopted or co-opted by pharmaceutical companies with the major side effects being ignored. So people should know about that as well. Will you talk a little bit about...
So we were talking about the ERMI.
Talk about the urine test.
Okay, sure. So we talked about the ERMI, we talked about the HERTSMI, we talked about the Petri dishes. So please, if you're going to get into real estate, please do that. For your health, for your family, for your children if you want to get pregnant. Regarding urine, there are a couple companies out there. I'm biased towards Great Plains. I don't have any financial interest or anything. I don't get paid by them. I just really enjoy Great Plains, and that's what I want to run on you, because we can do a combo test. We can do an organic acids, and we can do a mycotoxin from one urine screen. So it's fasted urine, because fasting increases the excretion of mycotoxins. So that's one benefit of, I know you talk about eating 2 meals a day. That's one benefit of that, because when you're doing these 14, 16, 18-hour fasts, you're going to be excreting more mycotoxins, probably because the body's not focused on digestion, right? So it's able to process and get rid of these mycotoxins. But you can also run a chemical profile on the urine, which is pretty cool. So if we have really, really sick people, or if we're working with the children on the autism spectrum, there's big correlation between that. If you look up autism, mycotoxins, the literature's there, because specifically ochratoxin damages the cerebellum. So when you see these kids that have balance and proprioception issues, a lot of it's due to the damage of the cerebellum, which I have other papers on using hyperbaric oxygen therapy to reverse that damage to the cerebellum. So hyperbaric oxygen will be another therapy if you've been injured by mold. But for the really sick kids, or for the adults that can't get pregnant, we're going to run chemicals too, because we're going to look at pesticides, because I'm convinced that it's the combination of the pesticide exposure which damages the beneficial bacteria in the gut. Also, mycotoxins reduce lactobacillus. And a lot of these beneficial microbes in your gut are what make your B vitamins and help you to synthesize your neurotransmitters. So the direct link between mycotoxin exposure and depression and anxiety, it's all happening in the gut, because the mold damages the microbes, then the microbes can't produce your neurotransmitters. So then you get put on an antidepressant, which is going to reuptake that low amount of serotonin, but the real root cause is detox the mold, get your beneficial microbes back up so you can make adequate levels of serotonin, which is 90% of it's made in the gut, but that can't happen if you've got this mycotoxin damage to the gut and to these microbes.
One of the things that we talked about in the first podcast was symptoms of mold toxicity. Let's just rehash that for people, and then maybe we can go into, we can continue down this rabbit hole and think, what can you do to detox from mold when you've been exposed?
Yeah, so this is just a presentation I did for Great Plains. I do practitioner training there, so I teach doctors and naturopaths and other people, practitioners, how to integrate treating mold in their practice, and this was a talk I gave for them. And this is not all-inclusive, but this is a big list here, and so if people are on audio, I don't want to read the whole thing off, but I'll just hit the big ones, which I see, which is fatigue. Dr. Brewer had a chronic fatigue clinic. 93 or 96% of his chronic fatigue patients had mycotoxins in the urine. So fatigue is directly linked in, chemical sensitivity. We talked about that. Blurry vision is a big one. So these are the people that turn 40 and they say, you know what, when I hit 40, my vision started changing. Is that due to the aging eye? Partially, but I also believe it's because they've accumulated so much mycotoxin. One of the ways you can test for mold if you don't have enough money is to do a visual contrast sensitivity test. It's called a VCS. And what happens is the blood flow to the eyes via the impairment of nitric oxide synthase. This is why erectile dysfunction happens too. If you don't have enough nitric oxide production, you don't have enough blood flow to the eyes, so you can't detect contrast well. So if you have vision issues and your eye doctor, like me, I went to the eye doctor. I need to post it on my Instagram. I had a photo of me with the big crazy thing at the eye doctor where they're flipping and doing this, and can you see this clearly and read the last line? I went to the eye doctor because my vision was so messed up. And he said, "You've got 20/20." I'm like, "How do I have 20/20? I can't freaking see. Like my eyes are going blurry." It was mycotoxins. And so that's one of Shoemaker's things, is promoting people to do the VCS test.
Which you
Shortness
can
of breath.
find, I'll just interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You can find that at VCSTest.com. Guys, it's a free test. I've done it on myself in the past. I haven't done it in a while. Maybe I should do another one. You can do it for free, and it's intense. It's very hard to see these things. I don't think I had anything major when I did it, but you can do that test for free. VCSTest.com.
I failed hardcore. Yeah, I really failed it. So memory issues, shortness of breath, which is interesting because I have a slide right here. Let's see, on this thing going around, and fungal diseases. And the crazy thing is, there's a lot of people going to the emergency room right now with shortness of breath. And the doctors, this was a report here, they said that several reports of people with pulmonary aspergillosis, this means where you're literally growing mold in your lungs, you have this ball of mold in your lungs, they can't tell whether it's the virus or whether it's the mold colonization creating the shortness of breath. So what I'm telling people is, if you test negative for the big C, but you have shortness of breath, it could be mold exposure. So that's interesting. Red eyes, light sensitivity, if all of a sudden, like if you're the type of person who has to wear sunglasses, sunglasses are bad for many reasons, but if you're the type of person who feels like you have to wear sunglasses all the time, consider mold toxicity. Lyme disease also does that because of some of the neuroinflammation, but mold has a lot of overlap. So a lot of these symptoms have overlap with Lyme. Many people with Lyme get worse by mold, or many people with mold get worse from Lyme. They kind of party together, I guess, is the way to say it, because Lyme chronically suppresses the immune system, and so does mold toxin. And so I think with me, with my history of being in the woods and having many tick bites, I think that's why mold took me down more, was because I had Lyme already from tick bites. What else should I show you on here? I've got a bunch of other crazy stuff. I mean, this was all about...
After the last talk, I think a lot of people wanted to know, okay, we've gone through it. If you're basically, if you're not thriving, I've said this on my social media, if you're thriving, don't change anything about your diet. Don't do anything. You're great. If you're not thriving, think about what you're missing. Are you getting organs? Are you eating grains? Are you eating leaves? Are you eating stems? Are you eating roots of plants that have plant defense chemicals? That's a topic of a different podcast. Are you eating seed oils? What are you doing in your life if you're not thriving? If you're not thriving and you've turned over all the stones, are you exposed to mold? Do you have mold toxicity? Get a urine test, use Great Plains or whatever lab you want, know what mold toxins come up on the urine, where you're getting those from. Are you getting them from grains? Are you getting them from wine? Are you getting them from coffee? Are you getting them from moldy grapes? Are you getting them from your environment? Do an ERMI test in your house. Do Petri dishes in your house. What's next, Evan? Say somebody's remediated, they've cleaned up their house. How can people begin to go forward from there with mold?
So binders, I mean, I think binders for life. I mean, we're constantly being exposed to stuff. I mean, even the Whole Foods here in Louisville, Kentucky is extremely moldy. I can tell you specifically where the mold is. Unfortunately, I'm sensitized to it, so I can feel it. I can tell you this section of the store is more moldy than this section of the store. And if you kind of peel back some of those drink containers, I mean, you can see mold growing in these things because of the constant humidity. So long story short, you're constantly going to be exposed to this. And if you were to do a test, this was a case study here of a 3-year-old that was diagnosed with autism. He had levels of gliotoxin. You want less than 200. This child had 15,893 of gliotoxin. This comes from Aspergillus mold. Ochratoxin, you want less than 4. They changed the reference range since this, but he was at a 74. So if you test positive like this means genetically you have an issue that you can't detox it. Meaning, when you go to that moldy Whole Foods, when you go to that moldy restaurant, when you go to that moldy hotel in Cabo for the week, and you come back feeling like crap, you need to know that you've filled up your bucket. Now, how you win against this is if your rate of detox is greater than your rate of exposure. So if Monday through Friday you're working in a clean office or at a clean home, and on the weekends you go out and you get these exposures, you should be able to make it, and you should be able to stay well. In certain people, they have to go on mold sabbaticals where they just live in a bubble and they try to just avoid these moldy places. For me, I just stay on a permanent sabbatical, meaning if I go into a moldy bookstore and I smell it or see it, I'm leaving. Because if I stay in there long enough, I may get depressed. I may get anxious. I may just feel dizzy. I may feel spacey. Now, most people are not that sensitive because they haven't been sick like that. But when you have a huge mold exposure, your bucket gets so full that there's actually a name for it. They call it TILT, tilt. It's like toxin-induced loss of tolerance. That's what it is. Toxin-induced loss of tolerance. This can happen with pesticide exposure and chemical exposure. People that work in agriculture who got a big, let's say they got hit in the face with a big amount of pesticide. Now small amounts of pesticide make them sick. This tilt phenomenon happens with mold. And so I personally stay on binders. I do a binder every night before bed, either activated charcoal or silica or pectin or fulvic acids. My wife, we just got her urine run, and fortunately, she's completely clear of mycotoxins. So we've completely cleared her out. It took us 2 years to do it, but we did it. Now, if you can totally get clean, maybe you don't need lifelong detox, but most people, except for you're killing it. You're in fresh air all the time in Costa Rica. So like you're exempt, but most people that are in closed buildings all the time, they're probably getting exposed. And if you test positive in the urine, you're not detoxing it well. You should continue on with something. All I'm saying is like a $10, $15 bottle of activated charcoal, 1 capsule a night. Like this is simple, cheap, and effective. And everyone can get well if they put this all together. Now, that doesn't mean the mitochondrial dysfunction, the depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, personality changes, mood changes, behavioral changes, tics, where children like flap their hands or they do their head in weird motions. Just detoxing may not fix all of that. There may be other repair work you need to do to the gut, to the brain chemistry, but just the detox alone, just simply removing the toxin, a lot of times is enough to let the brain and the body start healing.
So I think start with binders. You talked about a few. Let's just make sure people know about these. Activated charcoal, pectin, silica.
Fulvic acid is really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, GI Detox, I'm fine to recommend that. We thought about private labeling it because we sell a ton of it, but I'm fine to recommend it because
GI Detox.
I trust it. GI Detox is good. It's clean. It's very effective. It's very gentle. And this is broad spectrum. And so it does have zeolite in it. And clays are better for certain mycotoxins. If you look up Great Plains, they've actually got a chart on this that you can look up. Great Plains has a chart about what type of mycotoxins you have and what type of binders you want to use. And so I can pull that up real quick because I think people should see it. And why it's important to know what you have is because if you go broad spectrum like this one, you may be wasting your time and money. So for example, if you just show up with ochratoxin, meaning if you were in a building that had aspergillus and all you show positive for is ochratoxin, for you to take a blend is stupid because you're only getting a tiny dose of charcoal. You need a charcoal specific product because that's the most appropriate binder for that mycotoxin. So here's what I'm talking about. And I'm sorry if my voice got choppy. The bandwidth when I'm trying to load a bunch of images may mess it up, but here's the image. Okay. So mycotoxins and their binders. So you can look at the scientifically proven method of detox. So OTAs, ochratoxin. So you can see cholestyramine, charcoal, clay, glucomannan, chlorella, humic acid works for all of those. Whereas something like zearalenone, which you and I talked about affecting fertility, affecting sperm, affecting testosterone, the only way to get zearalenone out is probiotics and clay. So you're going to want to focus on those if you test positive for zearalenone. If you show up with aflatoxin, clays, chlorella, and probiotics. So you can kind of spot treat if you want to, but I will tell you in the vast majority of cases, people are going to show up with multiple mycotoxins, and so we generally are giving them a broad spectrum formula that's going to have all of it. And you see why the conventional medical doctor treatment of cholestyramine is terrible, because look at all it's doing. All it's doing is taking care of cholestyramine. Well,
OTA, ochratoxin,
yeah, OTA, but so can charcoal. And charcoal is going to do it without the risk of damaging your mitochondria and, as you mentioned, reducing the ability to have fat-soluble vitamins. And so I wouldn't use cholestyramine. You can get healthy without it. So this is a pretty cool chart.
That's an amazing chart. Yeah, if you guys are listening to this, you can find it on the YouTube video. Maybe we can, I bet if you search Great Plains Laboratory, mycotoxins and their binders is the name of the chart that we're looking at. But if you guys really want this one, shoot us an email, radicalhealth@heartandsoil.co. We'll get you the chart, or send me a DM on social media. We'll try and get it to you through those channels. I love that. I think that that's a really good place for people to start. Think about your environment, clean that up, do some binders. Beyond that, I'm a little hesitant to recommend more or go into more in this podcast, because you need to be working with a practitioner. You need to be working with somebody like Evan, because things are going to get more complicated from there. So I think that that's this place to start, is binders, test with urine, know what type of mold toxin you've been exposed to, which will give you a sense of where it is in your home. Then you can focus on which binder you may want to start with. Again, not a fan of cholestyramine, not a fan of binding bile acids and reducing fat soluble vitamin intake. I think that coupled with all this is dietary stuff, right? Cut out the grains, cut out the moldy foods, cut out the grain finished beef. This is the benefit of an animal-based diet, guys. And that diet, especially because you're going to get organs either fresh or desiccated, is going to be a source of all the nutrients. None of this works in isolation. It's all working together. You have to have a good circadian rhythm. You got to make sure you're getting in the sun. You got to sleep well. Imagine that. You have to be a human that is trying to get out of the human zoo if you want to thrive. And that is multifaceted. I think we should probably wrap it up there for today. Evan, I'll give you the floor and you can say anything you want to wrap it up before this one gets too long. I want to get you back. The one thing that I would like you to comment on for a few minutes as we wrap up is Candida, because let's do another podcast on Candida and all of the causes of Candida. But I know that mold toxicity is one of these causes. I get a lot of people asking me, because I'm a proponent of fruit and honey, and they'll say, but isn't that going to trigger Candida? And I say to them, no, those are not the causes of candidal overgrowth in the human gut. There is something else that is the root cause. If you have Candida in the gut, and I'll get your perspective on this in a moment. I'm sort of ranting here. I apologize about that. But if you have Candida in the human gut, removing sugars may be helpful. But as soon as you reintroduce carbohydrates, which is a necessity for humans, I believe long-term ketosis is going to be harmful for humans from many perspectives, you're going to have that Candida recur. The answer to Candida is not antifungals. There is almost always something else going on, because you can try and get rid of the Candida with antifungal du jour, diflucan, whatever you want to use, fluconazole, whatever. It almost always recurs in my experience. You have to treat the root cause. One of those is mold, but why don't you wrap us all together with mold, talk about Candida, and then we will pause here in anticipation of yet another future action-packed podcast with Evan Brand.
Sure. Yeah, and I love your rants, Paul. I really do. So the CDC is freaking out right now for many reasons, but one in particular is an outbreak of what they're calling a dangerous fungal infection. And guess what it is? It's Candida, but it's specifically a type of tropical Candida. I guess you would pronounce this aureus? I don't know. Candida aureus is what I'm going to call it. And this is supposedly a rare yeast, this rare Candida problem. But what's happened is, as you mentioned, antifungals. So I'll talk about that for a second. Because women have been programmed that since their teenage years, when they first became sexually active, or maybe it was not related to sexual intercourse, maybe it just spontaneously happened, they got a vaginal yeast infection or some sort of issue with their vaginal microbiome. As you may have talked about before, you have a skin microbiome, you have a nasal microbiome, you have an oral microbiome, you have a gut microbiome, you have a vaginal microbiome, and all of these are balanced, hopefully, if you're doing these animal-based primal principles. But because of whether it's synthetic underwear or whether it's antibiotics during childhood for ear infections, or maybe there's something else with the diet affecting the pH, or sexual partners. We've seen women that get vaginal yeast infections after being with a certain partner, leading me to believe that the male has some sort of issue with his, I guess we'll call it a penile biome. Is that a thing?
Genital microbiome.
Yeah. That he's, injected her essentially with this, maybe a fungal metabolite, and then she develops a yeast infection. And I don't know if I haven't looked into the literature on this. I'll just tell you clinically, I have hundreds of women over the last 8 years of working clinically that have said, hey, every time I have sex with this particular male, my fiance, husband, whatever, I get a yeast infection. So we switch to condoms and that fixes it, but who wants to use condoms? And I say, I hear you. So let's look at the male. And every time we look at the male via urine, he shows up with Candida. And then if we get him on herbals like olive leaf and Paul d'Arco and some of these medicinal antifungal herbs and fix him, she no longer gets Candida infections from sex. So that's the interesting thing between male-female intercourse and Candida. But the CDC has said that this is a superbug. Candida is becoming a superbug because we've used an overused antifungal medication and it doesn't work as well as it used to. And so you were talking about diet, and I love reading the comments on your page, because I saw that when you post about it, people say, oh, well, Paul, what about Candida? Am I going to get that? You're telling me to eat honey. Is that going to create a problem? And then I saw a guy on your post the other day that said, well, what about the cravings? How do I deal with the cravings? Like, I'm wanting to do your diet, but I have all these cravings. And I will tell you, you have cravings for two reasons. Number one, you have a Candida problem. Number two, well, I could do more, but we'll go two. You have issues with your neurotransmitters. Specifically, low serotonin and low dopamine are going to cause massive cravings. So people that are self-medicating with dark chocolate, wine, sugar, starches, sweets, those people have low neurotransmitters. Now, that may be linked to the gut. So if you've got Candida, you've got bacterial problems, you've got mold, that's going to reduce the brain chemistry. Low brain chemistry is when you're worried, you're anxious, you're depressed, you have no focus, you have no drive. So you may go and eat that gluten-free donut and you get a temporary boost of pleasure chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, but then you quickly revert back to your low levels, which is hence this cycle of addiction and craving, addiction and craving. You eat the donut, you feel good, then you feel like crap and you feel stupid that you ate it. But underneath all of that could be a Candida problem, which can come from your pet. So if your dog has a Candida problem because they're eating garbage dog food that has mycotoxins, you would not believe this, but you can do a swab test of your dog and you can send your sample of your dog's, we'll just call it the fur microbiome, and many dogs show extremely high levels of Candida that's coming out of their fur. So this is why it's important for you to get your pet healthy and get your pet on an animal-based diet, because if they're off-gassing Candida, these spores are floating around in your bedroom. So if your cute little dog's in your bed at night, they're off-gassing Candida spores into the air. You breathe those Candida spores in. This can colonize your sinuses, and then it can drip down the back of your throat and colonize your gut. And so this is like a whole nother rabbit hole. And, I know eventually people's brains will get tired. So I'll just leave it at this. Sugar is not your friend, but fruit sugar is not going to trigger a Candida overgrowth. And I think this idea of a, quote, Candida diet where they're eliminating honey and eliminating fruit, I think it's BS, and I don't think you need to do it. I ate fruit the entire time when I was recovering from mold and Candida problems, and I won. And I no longer have Candida overgrowth. So please don't be afraid, don't be paranoid of fruit. Now, if you have histamine intolerance due to mold toxicity, something like a pineapple is probably not your friend, because that may irritate your histamine problem. So you may want to go lower glycemic. You may want to go with some organic berries instead. So avocado and pineapple, those may irritate you. Those are going to be higher histamine. But the actual sugar content of a pineapple, I don't think it's a big deal. There's some argument about you need to eat where you live latitude-wise. So if you're in New York City, maybe that pineapple is not congruent with your eyes and the amount of sunlight you're getting doesn't match the fruit and this whole thing. But I don't know. I don't know how much that really matters.
Thanks for all that, man. I think it's great. I just wanted to give people a teaser. We'll do a whole episode on Candida in the future. It's so interesting to think about your pets. Many people listening to this will have pets they love. And I hadn't even thought about the fact that the pet could transfer. We know that your microbiome is going to be different when you have a pet. And if your pet isn't eating good food, the microbiome of your pet that's going to affect yours is not going to be a good thing. And Candida could definitely come from that.
I hope I made it clear,
yeah.
But I may have forgot to mention this, because I tend to talk too long about Candida because I'm passionate about it. But here's the thing. Here's the end of the story. If you've treated Candida, you've taken antifungals, diflucan, fluconazole, itraconazole, your Candida came back, it's probably because you have mold. Stop using the antifungals and find the mold. If you keep having this yeast thing and you're pounding it and then it comes back and then you pound it and it comes back, you're not going upstream enough. And look, I'm not the mold guy because I wanted to be. I don't even know if I am the mold guy. I'm just a guy who got sick from it. And I started seeing that my clients were failing on the protocols that I used to use to fix their gut and fix their Candida problems. And I was missing this huge smoking gun that was mold. And so now I go upstream and I look at their house. I ask about the pet. I ask about the how's their dog's health? Do they have cancer? Do they have, skin problems? Is their dog allergic and has to be on some special diet? What the heck's going on? What are the other occupants in the home? How's your son? How's your husband's health? And I ask all these questions now. And then I found this big thing of mold. And I'm like, oh my God. So this is why when I put Sally on oregano oil, she got rid of the Candida for 3 months and then it came back. And then I put, Paul on Paul Diarco bark and he got better and he was doing all these antifungals and then it came back. I was missing it. And so I learned this through failure. And so I guess the best teacher is suffering and failure, but don't keep pounding it. And breast implants. Women, if you have breast implants, they're leaking. If not now, they will later. And they're moldy. I did a whole podcast with Dr. Andrew Campbell. He's a medical doctor who's been treating breast implant illness for 25 years. Every single woman that has breast implants that I test via urine, they have mold colonization. I did a whole podcast with a client of mine named Wendy Myers. She had over 90 symptoms when she first came to me. She had implants. She didn't know it until we got her urine looked at. And I said, Wendy, this is weird. Your house tests clear, but you've got some of the highest mold levels ever. Well, duh. It was inside of her. It wasn't in her house. It was her. And when she went to an explant surgeon and she got her breast implants removed, over 90% of her symptoms disappeared overnight just by simply removing the moldy breast implants.
It's crazy. You never think about breast implants being moldy, and we didn't cover that in the beginning of the podcast. So thanks for bringing that up again. And just so people know, the Paul you mentioned is not me. It was another client that you had, or maybe just a random example of somebody named Paul.
Oh yeah, I just made that up. Yeah, that wasn't you. Yeah,
it wasn't me. But that is amazing, man. And I want to add this: chocolate moldy as well. I did an Instagram post. Chocolate is bullshit. Got more pushback than almost anything. I'm actually afraid, Evan, to do the coffee is bullshit post. It's going to happen because this is yet another reason that coffee is bullshit. And yes, people will say, but there's these special coffee companies now that are making this mold-free, mycotoxin-free coffee. Great. That's a step in the right direction, but it still has caffeine, and caffeine is still going to change your glucose tolerance. I've seen a lot of people have reactive hypoglycemia. They can't eat fruit because they're doing too much caffeine during the day. So that's a whole topic for another podcast, but caffeine is a problem for humans. In addition to mold toxins, most of you are drinking coffee that is not mycotoxin-free. Be honest with yourself. Both chocolate and coffee are going to be moldy because they are seeds. And those
Post it, Paul. Don't be afraid, man.
Oh man. I'm going to have to do it. I'm going to have to be ready for the backlash. People don't want to hear that chocolate and coffee are bullshit because they probably have a little bit of a neurotransmitter issue going on from some other things. And they're needing these things to get through the day. Listen, I love all of you guys who are listening. I want to meet you where you are, but I have to tell you what I believe to be true. I'm an explorer. I'm an adventurer. I'm going to tell you what I believe to be true, even though many of you don't want to hear that chocolate and coffee are bullshit. Evan, thank you for this today. Amazing, brother. We're going to have to do a part 4 very soon. I'm sure people are going to be clamoring for it. Where can people find your podcast and more of your stuff?
Yeah, and check out the episodes that Paul and I did together. I think we've done 2, 3. I lost count, but they go huge instantly. We did one all about vegetables and why vegetables may be the source of your health problems.
On your podcast, yeah.
Yeah, on mine. And then we did another one all about cassava. People were tripping out about that because, Siete, they're a $200 million company now, and they're all cassava-based products. And you just dropped the bombshell on people there. So, woo! You got to get ready for that one. So take the red pill and check out those episodes. It's just called The Evan Brand Show. It's everywhere. It's on Spotify, Google. It's everywhere. And I've been putting out episodes every week for 10 years. There's over 400 episodes, 16 million downloads. So there's a lot of free content there. And then I've created 3 functional medicine training courses for doctors and for practitioners. If they want to learn more about this, you can learn how to read these labs, how to run them, how to make protocols. It's for health seekers too, but practitioners are benefiting it and integrating it. And so that's called Better Belly, Better Energy. And then I have a Healthy Home one where I give you a glorified house tour and I show you what I've done in my house to fix it. So those are just online courses. And then I do still do one-on-one calls with people as well. So it's all at the site, evanbrand.com.
Amazing, dude. You're a treasure. I look forward to this every time. Thanks, man.
I appreciate it.